Los Angeles was glowing beneath the orange light of the setting sun. Palm trees stretched toward the sky. Cars rolled slowly down the boulevard. Store windows reflected the golden evening, and crowds moved along the sidewalks, laughing, talking, and rushing toward whatever waited for them beyond the next street. But near the entrance of a small clothing store, almost invisible among the noise, a boy was sitting on the pavement. He looked no older than 14. His clothes were faded. His shoes were worn almost completely smooth. His hair was messy from the wind, and beside him sat a small cardboard box containing only a handful of coins. But nobody was looking at the box. They were looking at the guitar. It was old, very old. The wooden body was scratched in dozens of places. A crack ran across the lower half. One tuning peg was missing, and one of the strings had been replaced with something that clearly did not belong on a guitar. Every time the boy moved his fingers across the strings, the instrument made a faint buzzing sound. Yet the boy kept playing. He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and began to sing. The first words were soft, almost too soft to hear. Then the melody became recognizable. People walking past suddenly slowed down. A woman carrying shopping bags stopped. A man stepping out of a restaurant turned around. Two teenagers whispered to each other. The boy was singing Elvis Presley's "Love Me Tender." He wasn't perfect. His voice cracked on a few notes. His fingers missed a chord. Once, the damaged string made a terrible metallic sound. But there was something in his voice that made people stop. It wasn't technique. It was pain. The kind of pain that could not be learned from a music teacher. The boy opened his eyes and looked toward the street. For a moment he seemed to forget the crowd. He wasn't singing for money. He wasn't singing for fame. He was singing for someone who wasn't there anymore. Someone who had once told him that music could save a person when nothing else could. His mother. Her picture was folded inside his shirt pocket. A tiny photograph, worn around the edges from being touched too many times. The boy reached the final verse. His voice became quieter, and then he whispered the last words. The street went strangely silent. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. Then, someone dropped $1 into the cardboard box. Another person followed. Then another. The boy looked down. More money. But he didn't smile. He simply picked up the guitar and began playing again. Because there was one thing he needed to do before the night ended. He needed to finish the song exactly the way his mother had taught him. The boy's name was Daniel. At least, that was what his mother had called him. Daniel, never be ashamed of your sound. She had told him that many times. She used to work long hours and come home exhausted. But whenever Daniel picked up the guitar, she would sit beside him and listen. She wasn't a musician. She didn't know complicated chords. She couldn't read music. But she knew one thing. She knew how to recognize a song that came from the heart. And she loved Elvis Presley. There had been an old record in their apartment. The cover was cracked. The record itself had scratches. But whenever life became too difficult, Daniel's mother would put it on. Then she would sit beside him and smile. "Listen carefully," she would say. "Don't just hear the voice. Hear what he's feeling." Daniel never understood what she meant. Not when he was younger, but after she died, he finally did. It had been 6 months since he had heard her voice. 6 months since the apartment had become painfully quiet. 6 months since there had been anyone waiting for him when he came home. That was why he played on the sidewalk, because silence hurt more than hunger, and because every time he played "Love Me Tender," he could almost imagine his mother sitting beside him again. That evening, he had been playing for nearly an hour when something unusual happened. A black car slowed down across the street. Daniel didn't notice. Most people didn't. But the driver looked toward the sidewalk. Then he looked into the rearview mirror. The man sitting in the back seat had been staring out the window. He had heard something. A familiar melody. A voice carrying through the traffic. The driver slowed even more. The man in the back seat leaned forward. "Stop!" The driver glanced at him. "Here?" "Yes." The car pulled toward the curb. The door opened. A man stepped out. At first, only a few people recognized him. Then someone gasped. Another person whispered his name. And within seconds, the crowd began to turn. Elvis Presley was standing on the sidewalk. Daniel was still looking down at his guitar. He had no idea. He played another chord, then another. He began the next verse. Behind him, the crowd grew. People raised cameras. Someone shouted, "Elvis!" Daniel froze. His fingers stopped moving. Slowly, he looked over his shoulder, and there he was, Elvis Presley, standing only a few yards away. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. The guitar slipped slightly from his hands. Elvis looked at the boy, then at the broken instrument, then back at the boy. He didn't smile immediately. Instead, his expression became strangely serious. He walked closer. The crowd became louder, but Elvis raised one hand. Easy. The noise faded. Daniel stared at him. Elvis looked down at the guitar. "That's a rough-looking instrument." Daniel swallowed. "It was my mother's." Something changed in Elvis's face. He crouched slightly so they were closer to eye level. "She gave it to you?" Daniel shook his head. "No." He looked at the ground. "She found it." Elvis nodded slowly. "And she taught you that song?" Daniel hesitated. Then he said, "Yes." Elvis looked at the guitar again. "How long have you been playing?" Daniel shrugged. "Not very long." Elvis smiled faintly. "You're doing something right." Daniel looked confused. "I keep messing up." "So do I." The boy looked up. Elvis laughed softly. "Don't believe everything you hear about me." A few people in the crowd laughed. But Daniel didn't. He was still staring at Elvis as if he couldn't believe this was happening. Then Elvis asked the question that would change everything. "What's your name?" "Daniel." "Daniel what?" Daniel hesitated. "Just Daniel." Elvis understood immediately. He didn't ask again. Instead, he looked at the cardboard box, then at Daniel's shoes, then at his face. And for the first time that evening, Elvis seemed to notice something beyond the music. The boy wasn't simply busking. He was surviving. 5 minutes had passed since Elvis stepped onto the sidewalk, but the crowd had doubled. People were filming, some were whispering, others were shouting questions. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Elvis noticed. He turned toward the crowd. "Give the kid some room." The people moved back. Then Elvis sat down beside Daniel. Right there on the sidewalk, the superstar, the boy, the broken guitar between them. Daniel stared at him. What are you doing? Elvis smiled. Listening. Daniel laughed nervously. You don't have to. I know. Elvis pointed at the guitar. Play it again. Daniel looked down. My string is broken. Then play with the strings you have. Daniel looked at him. Elvis nodded. That's what music is. Daniel took a breath. His fingers returned to the guitar. He began. The melody was rough. The instrument buzzed. The rhythm wasn't perfect. But Elvis didn't interrupt. He simply listened. And as Daniel sang, something unexpected happened. Elvis's smile disappeared. His eyes lowered. He seemed to be somewhere else. Somewhere far away from Los Angeles. Far away from the cameras. Far away from fame. He seemed to be remembering a different life. A small house. A struggling family. A young boy dreaming of becoming someone. A mother who believed in him before anyone else did. When Daniel finished, Elvis remained silent. Then he quietly asked, "Where's your mother now?" Daniel's fingers stopped. The crowd became silent again. Daniel looked down. She's gone. Elvis's face changed. I'm sorry. Daniel nodded. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out the small photograph. He handed it to Elvis. Elvis took it carefully. He looked at the photograph. Then he looked at Daniel. She loved this song. She loved you. Elvis froze. Daniel continued. She used to tell me that one day I'd meet you. A few people in the crowd smiled, but Daniel didn't. He looked directly at Elvis. She said you'd understand. Elvis slowly lowered the photograph. Understand what? Daniel's eyes filled with tears. What it's like to lose everything. No one spoke. The traffic continued in the distance. But on that sidewalk, it felt as though the entire world had stopped. Elvis looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he handed the photograph back. His voice was quieter now. Your mother knew something. Daniel waited. Elvis looked at the broken guitar. You don't need a perfect guitar to tell the truth. Daniel wiped his eyes. Elvis placed one hand on the damaged body of the instrument. And you don't need a perfect life to make something beautiful. If you're listening to this story right now, take a second and imagine yourself standing on that sidewalk. A famous singer, a 14-year-old boy, one broken guitar, and one song that somehow connected two completely different lives. What would you have done if you were standing there? Would you have stopped to listen? Would you have walked past? And do you think Elvis should have taken the boy with him? Let me know in the comments. And tell me where you're watching from. Your city or your country? If this story is touching your heart, hit the like button, subscribe, and stay with us, because what Elvis did next was something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. Because Elvis wasn't finished. Not even close. He looked at Daniel and said, "Come on." Daniel blinked. "Where?" Elvis stood up. "Somewhere we can fix that guitar." Daniel looked at his broken instrument. Then at Elvis. "I can't pay you." Elvis smiled. "I didn't ask you for money." Daniel hesitated. Then he stood. The crowd began to whisper again. But before Daniel could take another step, Elvis stopped. He turned back toward the cardboard box. He picked it up. He handed it to Daniel. "Keep it." Daniel frowned. "Why?" "Because you earned it." Daniel looked at the handful of coins inside, then at Elvis. For the first time that evening, he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. They began walking toward the black car. Daniel carried the broken guitar. Elvis walked beside him. Neither of them knew that before the night was over, Daniel would learn something about Elvis that would change the way he saw him forever. And Elvis would discover something about Daniel that he had never expected. Because sometimes a broken guitar doesn't need to be repaired. Sometimes it simply needs someone willing to listen. And that night, on a crowded Los Angeles sidewalk, Elvis Presley had stopped listening to the world so he could hear one forgotten boy. The black car disappeared into the evening traffic. Daniel sat quietly in the back seat, his broken guitar resting across his knees. He had never been inside a car like this before. The seats were soft. The windows were dark. The city lights passed across the glass like flashes from another world. But Daniel barely noticed any of it. He kept looking at Elvis. The man sitting beside him didn't look like the person Daniel had seen on television. On television, Elvis was surrounded by lights, musicians, screaming fans, and enormous stages. Here, he was quiet, almost thoughtful. After several minutes, Elvis finally spoke. "How long have you been sleeping outside?" Daniel looked down. "I'm not." Elvis waited. Daniel sighed. "Sometimes." That answer was enough. Elvis didn't ask another question. He simply looked out the window. There was something about the boy that reminded him of another young boy he had once been. A boy who had known what it meant to have very little. A boy who had watched his mother worry about money. A boy who had learned early that dreams didn't always come with comfortable circumstances. Elvis remembered standing in front of a mirror with a cheap guitar, imagining himself on a stage. Nobody knew him then. Nobody cared. And perhaps that was why Daniel's voice had stopped him on the street. It wasn't because the boy sounded like a professional. He didn't. It was because Elvis recognized the hunger in him. The hunger to become something more than his circumstances. The car finally stopped outside a small music shop. Daniel looked through the window. "You know this place?" Elvis nodded. "I know the owner." They stepped inside. A bell rang above the door. The shop owner looked up. His eyes widened. "Elvis?" Elvis smiled. "Evening." The man stared at Daniel, then at the broken guitar. "What happened to that thing?" Daniel looked embarrassed. "It's my guitar." The owner smiled. "I figured that." Elvis placed the guitar on the counter. "Can you save it?" The shop owner examined it carefully. He ran his fingers along the crack. He checked the neck. He turned the instrument over. Finally, he shook his head. "She's been through a war." Daniel's expression fell. "Can you fix it?" The man looked at Elvis, then back at Daniel. "Maybe." Daniel looked relieved, but the shop owner wasn't finished. "Fixing it won't make it a good guitar." Daniel lowered his head. Elvis stepped closer. "Maybe it doesn't have to be a good guitar." The owner looked at him. Elvis smiled. "It just has to be his guitar." The shop owner nodded. "I understand." While the repairs began, Daniel stood beside Elvis. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. He felt safe. But there was still something bothering him. He looked at Elvis. "Why did you stop?" Elvis turned. "What?" "On the street." Elvis smiled. "I heard music. Lots of people were walking by." "I know." Then why me? Elvis didn't answer immediately. He looked around the shop, at the guitars hanging from the walls, at the old piano in the corner. Then he said quietly, "Because I know what it feels like when nobody stops." Daniel stared at him. Elvis continued, "When I was young, I used to play wherever I could. Sometimes people laughed. Sometimes they ignored me. Sometimes I wondered if anyone would ever hear me." Daniel listened carefully. "But your mother heard you," Elvis said. Daniel nodded. "She did." "Then she was already doing the most important thing." "What?" "She believed you were worth listening to." Daniel looked away. His eyes became wet. He didn't want Elvis to see him cry, but Elvis noticed. He didn't say anything. He simply put a hand on the boy's shoulder. The guitar took nearly an hour to repair. During that time, Daniel and Elvis sat in the back of the store. Daniel finally asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since the sidewalk. "Did you ever feel like giving up?" Elvis looked at him. "More times than you think." Daniel frowned. "But you're Elvis Presley." Elvis laughed. "That's exactly why you shouldn't believe everything you see." Daniel smiled. Elvis leaned back. "People see the lights. They see the clothes. They see the crowds. They think that's the whole story." He paused. "But everybody has a story before the applause." Daniel thought about that. Then he asked, "What was yours?" Elvis looked down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he told Daniel about being a poor kid, about his family, about his mother, about dreaming of buying things his family couldn't afford, about the first time he realized music might become more than a hobby. Daniel listened without interrupting. The more Elvis talked, the more Daniel realized something. The famous man sitting beside him wasn't talking down to him. He was talking to him as an equal. Two people who had lost someone important. Two people who had used music to survive. Two people who understood what it meant to miss someone and still keep going. Then the shop owner walked over. He held the guitar. "She's ready." Daniel stood immediately. The guitar looked almost the same. The scratches were still there. The crack was still visible. The body was still worn. But the strings were new. Daniel took it carefully. He played one chord. Clear, beautiful. He played another. His eyes widened. "It sounds different." Elvis smiled. "No." Daniel looked at him. "It sounds like you." Daniel couldn't stop smiling. Then Elvis did something unexpected. He took the guitar from Daniel. He sat down. The room became quiet. Elvis played the opening chords of "Love Me Tender." Daniel watched his fingers. But instead of performing the song for the boy, Elvis stopped after a few seconds. He handed the guitar back. "Your turn." Daniel shook his head. "I can't play after you." Elvis smiled. "That's the wrong way to think." He pointed toward the guitar. "You don't play after me." Daniel looked confused. "You play your own song." Daniel slowly lifted the guitar. His fingers trembled. Then he began. The same melody. But this time, the instrument didn't buzz. The notes were clear. Daniel's voice filled the little shop. The owner stopped working. A customer near the front door turned around. Everyone listened. And Elvis? He closed his eyes. He didn't move. When Daniel finished, nobody spoke. Then Elvis opened his eyes. "Now you understand." "Understand what?" "Why your mother kept telling you to play." Daniel smiled through tears. But the night wasn't over. When they stepped outside, several reporters had gathered. Someone had apparently recognized the car. Flashbulbs began popping. Questions came from every direction. "Elvis!"
"Who's the boy?"
"Is he your new musician? Did you discover him? What's his name?" Daniel stepped backward. The sudden attention frightened him. Elvis immediately moved between Daniel and the reporters. "That's enough," a reporter shouted. "Elvis, is he going to perform with you?" Elvis looked at Daniel. Then he looked back at the reporters. "He'll decide what he wants to do." Another reporter asked, "Where did you find him?" Elvis smiled. "On the sidewalk." The reporters laughed, but Elvis didn't. "He was already a musician before I met him." Daniel stared at him. Nobody had ever called him that before. Musician, not street kid, not beggar, not homeless boy. Musician. The word stayed with him. That night, Elvis arranged for Daniel to stay somewhere safe. But before Daniel left, Elvis gave him something. It wasn't money. It wasn't a fancy guitar. It was a small piece of paper. On it was an address. Daniel looked at it.
"What's this?"
"A recording studio." Daniel looked up. "Why?" "Because tomorrow morning you're going there." Daniel's mouth opened. "Me?" Elvis nodded. "You're going to record one song." Daniel's hands began shaking. "But I don't know how." "You'll learn." "What if I'm not good enough?" Elvis looked directly into his eyes. "Then you'll get better." Daniel stared at the paper. Elvis continued, "But don't make the mistake of deciding you're not good enough before you even try." Those words hit Daniel harder than anything else that night. He folded the paper carefully. Then he looked at Elvis. "Why are you doing all this?" Elvis smiled. "Maybe because somebody once gave me a chance." Daniel understood. Before walking away, he turned around. "Elvis?" "Yeah?" Daniel held up the repaired guitar. "Thank you." Elvis nodded. Then Daniel asked, "Will you come tomorrow?" Elvis smiled. "I'll see you there." Daniel walked away. Elvis watched until the boy disappeared around the corner. Then he stood alone beside the car. For some reason, he couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Daniel's mother. The words she had spoken. The way Daniel had said, "She said you'd understand." Elvis reached into his pocket. He realized he still had something. A small, folded piece of paper. Daniel had accidentally dropped it in the car. Elvis opened it. It was an old, handwritten note. Only one sentence was visible. "If anything ever happens to me, make sure Daniel never stops singing." Elvis read it twice, then a third time. His eyes became wet. He folded the note again. For the first time that night, Elvis understood why he had stopped the car. Maybe it hadn't been an accident. Maybe some songs find the people who need to hear them. If you are still with us, here's the question. Do you think Elvis was right to give Daniel a chance? Or should Daniel have been left to find his own way? Tell me what you think in the comments. And don't forget to write where you're watching from. Los Angeles, New York, London, India, Uzbekistan, or anywhere else in the world. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because the next morning, Daniel walked into a recording studio carrying the same old guitar. He thought he was there to record one song. He had no idea that someone inside the studio was about to hear his voice. and make a decision that could change his entire life. The next morning arrived too quickly. Daniel barely slept. He kept looking at the address Elvis had given him. He was afraid it might disappear. At exactly 8 o'clock, he stood outside the recording studio. He wore the cleanest clothes he owned. His repaired guitar was in his hands. He took a deep breath. Then he opened the door. Inside, microphones stood under bright lights. Engineers moved behind glass. Musicians carried instruments across the room. Daniel suddenly felt very small. He almost turned around. Then he heard a familiar voice. "You're late." Daniel froze. He turned. Elvis was standing near the doorway. Daniel smiled. "I'm not late." Elvis laughed. "Good." He walked over. "You ready?" Daniel looked at the microphone, then at his guitar, then at Elvis. "No." Elvis smiled. "Perfect." "Why perfect?" "Because now you'll actually be honest." Daniel stepped toward the microphone. His hands trembled. The studio lights came on. The engineer raised his hand. Silence. Daniel looked through the glass. Elvis gave him a small nod. Daniel closed his eyes and began to sing. The first note shook. The second was stronger. By the third, the entire room was listening, and somewhere behind the glass, Elvis slowly lowered his head, because he had heard something that morning. Something more powerful than talent. He had heard a boy who had finally found his voice. And Elvis knew. The broken guitar had never really been the thing that needed fixing. It had been the boy's belief that anyone would ever listen. Now someone was listening, and this time, Daniel wasn't alone. The recording studio was completely silent. Daniel stood behind the microphone with both hands wrapped tightly around his old guitar. His heart was beating so hard that he could hear it. Behind the glass, several musicians were watching him. An engineer sat with his hand above the controls, and beside the studio window stood Elvis Presley. Daniel looked at him one last time. Elvis nodded. "Don't sing for them." Daniel swallowed. "Then who do I sing for?" Elvis smiled. "Sing for the person who taught you." Daniel closed his eyes. He thought about his mother. He remembered her sitting on the edge of their old sofa. He remembered the way she used to tap her fingers against her knee whenever Elvis's records played. He remembered her voice. "Don't just hear the music, Daniel. Feel it." Daniel took a breath. Then he began. The first note came out softly, almost like a whisper, but it was steady. The room became still. His fingers moved across the repaired strings. For the first time, the guitar didn't sound broken. But Daniel did not sound like Elvis. He didn't try to. His voice was young, fragile, sometimes rough, but it was his. And that was exactly what made everyone stop listening to the technical imperfections. They were listening to the story. A boy who had lost his mother, a boy who had slept on streets, a boy who had once believed nobody would ever hear him. And now he was standing behind a professional microphone. When Daniel reached the final words of the song, his voice cracked. He stopped. For a second, he couldn't continue. His eyes filled with tears. He looked through the glass. Elvis didn't say anything. He simply placed his hand over his heart. Daniel understood. He continued singing. The last note faded. Nobody moved. Then the engineer slowly removed his headphones. That was... He couldn't finish. Elvis smiled. "Yeah, The engineer looked at Daniel. "Kid, do you know what you just did?" Daniel shook his head. "You told the truth." Daniel lowered his eyes, and then something unexpected happened. Elvis walked into the recording room. He stood beside Daniel. He looked at the microphone, then at the guitar. "Play it again." Daniel looked shocked. "Again?" Elvis nodded. "But why?" "Because this time I want you to play it for yourself." The second recording was different. Daniel wasn't thinking about his mother anymore. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He wasn't thinking about the money. He wasn't even thinking about Elvis. He simply played, and when he finished, he smiled. It was the first completely free smile he had shown in a very long time. Elvis knew something had changed. Daniel wasn't just surviving anymore. He had started believing. After the recording, the studio engineer approached Elvis. "You know what this kid needs?" Elvis looked at him. "What?" "A chance." Elvis smiled. "That's exactly what I was thinking. But there was a problem. Daniel was still a child. He needed school. He needed somewhere safe to live. He needed stability. A record deal wasn't the answer. Fame wasn't the answer. Elvis knew that better than anyone. So instead of putting Daniel on stage immediately, Elvis made a different decision. He contacted people who could help. He arranged for Daniel to have a safe place to stay. He made sure the boy could continue school, and he found him a proper music teacher. But there was one condition. Daniel had to promise that he wouldn't quit his education just because someone told him he had talent. Daniel agreed. Then Elvis gave him the repaired guitar. "Keep it." Daniel stared at him. "But it's not mine anymore." Elvis shook his head. "It was yours when it was broken." He tapped the guitar gently. "It belongs to you even more now." Daniel held it against his chest. Then he asked, "Will I ever see you again?" Elvis looked at him. "Yes." "When?" Elvis smiled. "When you're ready." Daniel nodded, but he didn't know how long ready would take. Weeks became months. Daniel went to school. He practiced every day. He learned chords. He learned rhythm. He learned how to read music. He learned that becoming a musician wasn't about one magical night. It was about thousands of ordinary mornings when nobody was watching. Some days he wanted to quit. Some days his fingers hurt. Some days his teacher told him he wasn't practicing enough. And whenever he became frustrated, he remembered Elvis's words, "Don't decide you're not good enough before you even try." So he kept going. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. Daniel opened it. His hands began shaking. It was an invitation. A small charity concert was being organized. They wanted Daniel to perform. He stared at the letter for a long time. Then he smiled. He immediately thought of Elvis. But Elvis wasn't there. He was busy with his own career, so Daniel prepared alone. The night of the concert, hundreds of people filled the room. Daniel stood behind the curtain. His old guitar was in his hands. The same guitar, the same scratches, the same repaired crack. He touched the wood. For a moment he could almost hear his mother's voice. Then the announcer spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Daniel." The curtain opened. Daniel walked onto the stage. The applause was polite. He looked into the audience. Then he began. The first chord was soft. The second was stronger. And then he sang, "Love Me Tender." The room changed. People stopped talking. A woman in the front row began crying. A man lowered his head. Daniel didn't know why. He simply kept singing. When he finished, the audience stood. The applause became enormous. Daniel stood frozen. He had performed in front of hundreds of people, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. If you've stayed with Daniel this far, here's today's question. Do you believe one person's kindness can completely change another person's life? Write yes or no in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. If Daniel's story has touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happened after that concert was something Daniel never expected. A man approached him backstage. He wasn't a musician. He wasn't a reporter. He was simply an older gentleman carrying a small envelope. He handed it to Daniel. This came from Elvis. Daniel stared at him. Elvis? The man nodded. Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was a short, handwritten note. Only a few words. Keep playing. Your mother was right. Daniel read it once, then again. His eyes filled with tears. He pressed the note against his chest. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat beside the window with his guitar, and for the first time since his mother's death, he didn't feel completely alone. Years passed. Daniel grew older. His voice changed. His hands became stronger. He performed in small clubs, then larger venues. He recorded songs. He traveled. People began recognizing his name, but he never forgot the sidewalk. He never forgot the cardboard box. He never forgot the black car. And most importantly, he never forgot the man who had stopped. Whenever someone asked him about his career, Daniel always told the same story. Everything began with a broken guitar. People laughed. They thought he was exaggerating, but Daniel wasn't. He still kept the guitar. It sat in a glass case in his home. The wood was scarred. The paint was faded. The repaired crack was still visible. Beside it was a photograph of his mother, and underneath the photograph was Elvis's handwritten note. Keep playing. Your mother was right. Daniel protected those three things more carefully than any award he ever received. Then came the news. Elvis Presley was gone. Daniel was already a successful musician by then, but when he heard the news, he didn't think about fame. He didn't think about records. He didn't think about the legend. He thought about a man sitting beside him on a dirty sidewalk, a man who had looked at a poor boy and seen something worth saving. Daniel locked himself in his room. He took the broken guitar out of its case. He sat down, and he began playing. Love Me Tender. He couldn't finish. His voice broke. He placed his hand over the strings. For several minutes he simply sat there. Then he whispered, "Thank you." Years later, Daniel was invited to perform at a major concert honoring Elvis. Thousands of people filled the venue. Huge screens showed images from Elvis's career. The crowd screamed when his name appeared. Daniel stood backstage. His hands were trembling. An organizer approached him. "Are you ready?" Daniel looked down at the guitar. The old guitar. The broken guitar. The guitar Elvis had once repaired. "Yes." He walked onto the stage. The crowd became quiet. Daniel stood alone beneath one spotlight. No dancers, no giant band, no special effects, just him and the guitar. He looked toward the empty space beside the stage. Then he smiled. "I was 14 years old when Elvis Presley found me." The audience became silent. I thought he saved my guitar. Daniel looked down. But I was wrong. He paused. He saved me. Someone in the audience began crying. Daniel continued. He didn't give me fame. He didn't promise me a career. He gave me something much more important. He touched the guitar. He gave me a reason to believe that my voice mattered. Then Daniel began playing. The first chords of Love Me Tender filled the room. His voice was older now, deeper, stronger, but the emotion was the same. When he reached the final verse, he looked upward, and for one brief moment, he imagined his mother sitting somewhere in the darkness, smiling, exactly the way she used to. Daniel finished the song. The final note disappeared. Silence. Then the entire audience stood. The applause lasted for minutes. Daniel lowered his head. Tears ran down his face. He held the guitar against his chest and whispered, "Mom." He heard me. That became the story Daniel told for the rest of his life. Not the story of how Elvis discovered a young singer, not the story of a famous man giving a poor boy a guitar. It was the story of two people who met for a few minutes on a sidewalk and changed each other's lives. Elvis had stopped because he heard a familiar song, but perhaps the real reason was deeper. Perhaps he heard a younger version of himself, a poor kid with a dream, a kid nobody knew, a kid who needed someone to stop. And that evening, Elvis stopped. He didn't walk past. He didn't send someone else. He didn't simply throw money into a cardboard box. He sat down. He listened. And sometimes, that's all a broken person needs. Someone to listen. Someone to say, "Your voice matters." Daniel never forgot that. And every time he played Love Me Tender, he remembered the old sidewalk, the broken guitar, his mother's photograph, and the man who stepped out of a black car and changed everything. The boy who once played for coins became a musician, the broken guitar became a symbol, and the song became a promise. A promise that even when life breaks something inside you, it doesn't mean the music has to end. Sometimes the most beautiful songs begin with something broken.